I'm thrilled that the UN has centered its work and the history of slavery as a component of its important work. Without this reckoning with our history of slavery, we won't actually resolve many of the challenges that we still contend with. Identity is important. And I want to start by just talking about what it means to create an identity to talk about these issues, because I actually think that the UN, that national leaders, that governments, that cultural institutions have a critical role to play to help our world reckon with the legacy of slavery. But it's important that our identities are things that we carefully curate. You can be a teacher, but it's only if you're a committed and dedicated and compassionate teacher that you'll have an impact on the lives of your students. You can be a physician, but physicians who don't listen, physicians who don't care, don't have the same results when it comes to healing. You can be an advocate, but if your advocacy isn't rooted in something genuine and persuasive, you fail. And so it matters that our cultural institutions have been silent for so long about the history of slavery. We have failed to create the kind of reckoning, to create the kind of understanding that will help our world understand the importance of dealing with this legacy. And I don't say this just to judge. I say this because I think we have to be intentional about the kind of identity we now create. This is an opportunity for art, museum, cultural institutions, governments all across the globe to begin creating an identity that is not afraid to deal honestly with this history. I talk about identity a lot. I'm going to repeat a story that some of you may have heard me tell before, but I learned a lot about identity from my grandmother. My grandmother was the quintessential African-American matriarch. She was the power in our family. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. Her parents were born in slavery, and being the child of people who were enslaved gave my grandmother this worldview. She was very tactical. She was very strategic. She was tough. She was strong, but she was kind and she was loving. My grandmother was the end of every argument in our family. She was the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And the difficulty I had was that my grandmother had 10 children, and I had lots of cousins who were always competing for her time and attention. And when I would go spend time with her, my cousins would always be running around trying to get her attention. And I remember this one time when I was at her house, and I woke up and my cousins were running around, but my grandmother sat across the room and she was staring at me, and she had this very sober look on her face. And I couldn't figure out why she was looking at me like that. And she got up and she walked across the room and she said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk." And she took me out back. We went outside and we sat down, and my grandmother said, "I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama." And then she said, "I want you to know I've been watching you, and I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." I remember looking up at her. I remember this conversation just like it happened yesterday. Then she said, "But you have to promise me 3 things, Bryan." I said, "Okay." She said, "The first thing I need you to promise me is that you'll always love your mother." She said, "That's my baby girl, and I need to know you're always going to take care of her." So I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." I adored my mom. So I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." Then the second thing she said was, "I need you to promise me you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing." And I thought about it, and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then she said, "The third thing I need you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." Well, I was 10 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." I have a brother who's a year older than me and a sister who's a year younger than me, and when we were about 14 or 15 or 16, one day my brother came home and he'd gotten beer somewhere. I don't know where he got this beer, but he grabbed me and he grabbed my sister and he took us out back. He said, "Hey, y'all, I got some beer." And he took a sip, and he gave some to my sister, and she took a sip, and they offered it to me, but I hesitated. I said, no, I'm not going to have any beer. Y'all go ahead. And my brother said, "Come on, we're having beer. I got this. You have some. I had some. Your sister has some. You have some." I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then my brother looked at me really hard, and he said, "I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, Mama tells all the grandchildren that they're special and makes them..." I was devastated. But I'm going to admit something to you. I'm now a lot older, and what I'm going to admit to you is that I've never had a drop of alcohol in my life. And I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because I do believe that when we create identities that are rooted in truthfulness, when we create identities that are rooted in desire to heal and to bridge and to restore, we have the power to say things to people that they might not otherwise appreciate, that they might not otherwise accept. When I think about my grandmother, of course she thought all her grandchildren were special. But there was a power in her life, there was a power in her witness that I couldn't shake. Some of the greatest art museums in the world, some of the greatest institutions in the world draw millions of people inside. And we haven't talked honestly about a core component of our history, and that is the legacy of slavery. The Transatlantic Slave Trade was devastating. It was global. There are very few places in the world that weren't touched by the abduction, the kidnapping, the trafficking of 12 million people across the Atlantic Ocean. And when you think about it, it was devastating not just in the crime that it committed on those who were trafficked, but on the displacement of their descendants. If I take a DNA test, I show up in about 16 countries in West Africa. I wasn't just disconnected from a family or tribe, I was connected from an identity that's very, very difficult to replicate. And that harm, that bondage, that suffering is something that we have ignored for too long. I had the great privilege of going to Nigeria several years ago. It was the first time I went to Africa. And when I got there, a lawyer greeted me, and he took me around Lagos late at night. And I had a beautiful experience meeting people there in the cities, but I was really tired. And at some point I said, look, I got to get home and get some sleep so I can catch my flight to Abuja the next morning. He said, I just got to take you one more place. And this beautiful, enthusiastic young lawyer who had taken me all around Lagos took me to the ocean. And we climbed across the bridge, the concrete there, onto a beach. It was late at night. It wasn't a particularly beautiful space, but he wanted me to see it. And I found myself standing on the shore there, and this incredibly generous and very, very energetic young lawyer all of a sudden got very quiet. It was pitch dark, and I was looking across the ocean. And then that young lawyer did something I'll never forget. He turned to me and he said, I brought you here because I wanted to say, I'm sorry that this is where we lost you. And for the first time in my life, I was standing on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And I had the experience of reckoning with the fact that I'm one of the lost children of the African continent. I also reckoned with the fact that for the first time in my life, someone apologized to me about the pain, the agony, the brutality of the experience of enslavement. And it wasn't someone in America, it was someone on the African continent. But those words meant something to me. I have never forgotten them. And we have an opportunity in our countries, in the world today, to do something bigger and better to reckon with this history. I think we have to begin a new conversation. We have to begin a new era across the globe of truth and justice when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, of truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration, truth and reparation, because we have for too long been silent about the consequences of this devastating history. I actually don't think the great evil of slavery was the bondage and the brutality and the forced labor. Those things were horrific, but the greatest evil of slavery was the narrative we created to justify enslavement. You see, we have all inherited, in many parts of the world, a narrative of racial difference. That narrative in the United States, it's like a toxin. You can't go anywhere in the United States without seeing these toxins in the air, without experiencing the residue of this pollution created by a narrative of racial difference. It doesn't matter whether you're on the West Coast, the North, the East, anywhere you are in this country, you're in a space where there's a long history of racial injustice created by the narratives of racial difference. And it creates distrust and conflict and violence. And we have been silent for too long about that narrative. And I believe we have to start talking about things that we haven't talked about before. In this country, we have to talk about the fact that we are a post-genocide society. I think what happened to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. There were tens of millions of indigenous people on the lands of the United States before Europeans came. By the end of the 1800s, there were fewer than 500,000 indigenous people left. They've been killed from famine and war and disease. We created a great constitution in America that talked about equality and justice for all, but we didn't apply those concepts to indigenous people because we said, no, those native people, they're savages. And we created this narrative of racial difference. And it became like an infection, and it spread. And it was that narrative of racial difference that allowed us to justify 2.5 centuries of slavery. And as I've argued, I don't think the great evil of American slavery was the bondage and the brutality. The truest evil, the greatest evil, was the narrative we created to justify slavery, because enslavers did not want to feel immoral or unjust or unchristian. And so they needed a narrative to allow them to reconcile with the brutality of taking children from grieving mothers, from separating people who loved one another. And so they made up this false narrative that black people aren't as good as white people, that black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved, less decent, less human. And that narrative was the greatest evil, because what it gave rise to was an ideology of white supremacy, an ideology of racial hierarchy. And that narrative was so powerful that in this country, even though the North won the Civil War, the South won the narrative war, that idea survived the Civil War. And we created a constitutional provision to protect enslaved people, an equal protection clause. We created a right to vote, but none of those rights were enforced for a century, because this idea of racial hierarchy was so powerful that our courts stepped back, our Congress stepped back, the institutions of the world stepped back. And that gave rise to a century of terror and violence. And for 100 years, black people in America were pulled out of their homes, they were beaten, they were drowned, they were tortured, they were lynched, sometimes on the courthouse lawn. And our government did nothing about it. We didn't respond. Black people went to Europe to fight during World War I. They went to Europe during World War II. They came back in their uniforms and they were lynched and terrorized because they were seen as threats to this racial order of Jim Crow. 6 million black people fled the American South during the first half of the 20th century. They left lands that they owned. They left opportunities for skills and wealth that they could have passed on to their children, but they were forced away from the lands by this terror and violence. We have a wealth gap in America today that can't be understood without understanding this exodus that was created by terror and violence. And we haven't really talked about the demographic geography of this country. The black people in Chicago, the black people in Harlem, the black people in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in Minneapolis, in Boston, most of the black people in these communities didn't go to these communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And even though they didn't face the same risk of mob violence, they weren't welcomed. We didn't give them the kind of treatment we should give to someone who has survived terror and violence. They were excluded, and the footprint of that exclusion could be seen in this country today. And the worst part of this is that narrative of presumption, that presumption of dangerousness and guilt, that narrative of racial difference followed them. And they were subjected to it even in the North and the West. And yes, we had a heroic civil rights movement in the American South in the 1950s and 60s where courageous people did extraordinary things to break down the legal architecture of racial hierarchy. But the narrative of presumption, that presumption of dangerousness and guilt, that continued. And what burdens me today, and why you saw people out on the streets protesting after the police violence that was so dramatically displayed when George Floyd was killed, what burdens me today is that it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how kind you are. You can be a UN delegate, you can be a professor, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be a teacher, but if you're black or brown, you will go places in this country where you have to navigate a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. I've argued a bunch of cases at the United States Supreme Court. We won a case banning mandatory life sentences for children, and I was going around the country representing children who benefited from this ruling, and I was in a courtroom in the Midwest, and I remember sitting there waiting for the hearing to begin. I was sitting at defense counsel's table, and when the judge walked in, he saw me, and he got angry. He said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I explained to him, I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson, I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I remember gripping the chair and making myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client, who was more vulnerable than I was. We did the hearing, but after the hearing, I was sitting in the car thinking, wow, here I am, this middle-aged black man in my best suit with all of these degrees and with all of these honors, and I'm still required to laugh at my own humiliation to do justice for my client. And what I'm telling you is that when you have to constantly navigate presumptions of dangerousness and guilt, when you have to constantly find ways around this burden that's been created by our silence, you get exhausted. And it's exhausting to be entering the 21st century, still weighed down by the legacy of slavery, by the silence. And that is why I think we have to commit to a new era of truth-telling. And I think cultural institutions, museums, institutions like the United Nations can play the leading role in helping us reckon with this history. In South Africa, after apartheid, they recognized that there had to be a process of truth and reconciliation. And the victims of apartheid had a chance to give voice to their harm. And even some of the perpetrators had an opportunity to talk about the wrongdoing. It's fascinating to me how that was achieved there, and yet it has not been replicated in most places in the world. It's interesting when I go to Berlin, Germany. I think Berlin's a fascinating city when it comes to truth-telling about history. Because in Berlin, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers or stones or symbols or icons that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin. And the cab drivers and the hotel operators encourage everybody to go to the Holocaust Memorial. In Germany, students are required to spend time at Holocaust sites. They are required to study it. They don't have people in Germany saying, oh, we can't teach our children about the Holocaust because that might make them feel uncomfortable or ashamed. There's a reckoning. And what I think is fascinating to me is that there are no Adolf Hitler statues in Berlin. There are no monuments to the perpetrators of the Holocaust. But I live in a region of the country where the landscape is littered with iconography celebrating those who defended enslavement, who sought to extend enslavement. And when we talk about challenging that or changing that, it's seen as controversial. That is a consequence of silence, our collective silence. And that is why I believe it is urgent that cultural institutions around the world find new ways to give voice to the importance of reckoning with the history of slavery. And we have to do it honestly. We have to do it boldly. I'm so thrilled that the Rijksmuseum has created this exhibit, but it's just a start. There's so much more that has to be done. And sometimes I think people hear me talking about slavery and lynching and segregation, and they think I want to punish the nations that were complicit in slavery. I have no interest in punishment. My interest is liberation. I actually think we need to liberate all of the societies of the world that were complicit in the institution of slavery. We got not only to liberate those who are still burdened as descendants of the enslaved, but we have to liberate those communities and societies. I am persuaded that there is something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, more like justice waiting for us, but we can't get there if we're unwilling to talk honestly about this history. At the Legacy Museum in Montgomery and at the National Memorial, and I want to invite everybody to come and see us in Montgomery, we've created these exhibits, and they're challenging. We tell people it's challenging to come to our museum because you have to walk through that wall of water. You'll see sculptures that talk about the agony of enslavement. We depict the brutality of slavery, but the dignity of those who were enslaved. It's a first-person museum where we have voices and we take narratives written by enslaved people to help folks understand this legacy. One of the exhibits we have in our museum is a collection of 800 jars of soil. And we've asked people around the country to go to lynching sites and collect soil from where people were lynched. And we put the name of the lynching victims and the date of the lynching on the jar. And they bring them back to the museum, and we have this whole exhibit that documents this history. Well, we were asking people to contribute to the exhibit. And a middle-aged black woman came up to me and said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to dig soil for the museum. And so we said, okay, and we gave her an empty jar with the name of a lynching victim in Alabama. We gave her the memo that talked about the lynching. We gave her an implement to dig the soil. And she went to her site, which was in a very remote location in West Alabama. And when she got there, she told me that she got afraid. It was a very isolated space. It was on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. And she said, Mr. Stevenson, I had to pray to find the courage to get out of the car. She said, but I found my courage, and I got out of the car, and I crossed the road. I found the spot where the man was lynched, and I got down on my knees to begin digging the soil. But as soon as I got down on the ground, she said, a pickup truck came down the road, and there was this big white guy in the truck, and he stared at her as he drove by. She said she got really nervous. The truck stopped, the truck turned around, drove back by again, and stared at her some more. She said her heart started to pound. And then to her great dismay, this man parked his truck, got out of it, and started walking toward her. And when this big white guy was walking toward her, her heart was just pounding. And sure enough, the man walked up to her and he said, excuse me, but what are you doing? And we tell people when they're digging the soil that they don't have to explain what they're doing. We say, if you want to just say you're getting dirt for your garden, you can do that. And she told me, she said, Mr. Stevenson, I was going to tell that man I was just getting some dirt from my garden. She said, but all of a sudden, something got a hold of me. And she said, I told that man, I'm digging soil here because this is where a black man was lynched in 1937, and I'm going to honor his life today. She said she looked down and just started digging. And then the man surprised her. And he asked her, he said, does that paper talk about the lynching? And she said, it does. And then he said, can I read it? And she gave him the paper to read. And he started reading while she started digging. And after a few minutes, the man surprised her even more. He said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you?" And she said, "Yes." And the man got down on his knees and she offered him the implement to dig the soil, but he said, "No, no, 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 you use that, I'll just use my hands." And then she said he started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar, throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar. And she said there was something about the conviction with which he was putting his whole body into lifting up this soil that just moved her. She said, "Mr. Stevenson, I couldn't help it. A tear started running down my face." And the man looked at her and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm upsetting you." And she said, "No, no, no, you're blessing me." And he kept digging with his hands and she kept digging with the implement, and they were filling up the jar. And when they were getting near the top, she looked over at the man and she noticed that his face had turned red and that he had slowed down and that his shoulders had dropped. And then she said she saw a tear running down his face. And she stopped and she put her hand on his shoulder and she said, "Are you all right?" And that's when she said, the man said, "No, ma'am, no, ma'am." And then he said, "I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who helped lynch this man." And she said they both sat on that roadside and wept. After a few minutes, the man said, "Ma'am, I really want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil." She said, "Okay." But then she said, "But I want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil." And they took pictures of one another holding this jar of soil. And she said, "Well, I'm going back to Montgomery to put this in the museum." And the man said, "Would it be all right if I followed you?" And she said, "Sure." And I was there when these two people who met on a roadside at a place of terror and violence and shame came in together and did something beautiful by contributing that jar to that exhibit. I'm not naive. I don't think beautiful things like that always happen when we tell the truth. But I am persuaded that we deny ourselves the beauty of justice when we refuse to tell the truth. We do not have to fear truth-telling about this history. We do not have to worry that these truths will undermine our ability to build a healthier society. What we have to worry about is that the politics of fear and anger, which are growing all across the globe, will keep us from getting to these things. I worry about these narratives of fear and anger. Fear and anger are the essential ingredients of oppression and injustice. Go anywhere in the world where people are being mistreated. If you ask the abusers why they're doing what they do, they can give you a narrative of fear and anger. We have to fight against fear and anger with truth and hope. And that's what cultural institutions have the power to do. We have, many of us in this room, inherited the harm, the trauma, the bondage, the suffering of descendants who had to endure the legacy of slavery, but we've inherited something else. I spent all of the pandemic in Montgomery, and it gave me the opportunity to think about the people who came before me. And the thing that I think our institutions have the capacity to do is to give the world hope about our ability to get to a better place. And that's what I thought about during the pandemic, because I realized that I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. The generation that came before me in Montgomery would put on their Sunday best. They'd go places to push for the right to vote. They'd go places to push to end segregation. They'd be on their knees praying, and they'd get beaten and battered and bloodied, and they'd go home, clean themselves off, and go back and do it again. There's a power in this story of what people have done to overcome. There's a triumph in this story, and we need to wrap our arms around it and appreciate the power it gives us. I'm going to admit to something I don't like admitting to. I'm a lawyer, as was said. I wish I had a more tactical explanation, but I was a philosophy major in college, and during my senior year, somebody came up to me and said, "You know, nobody's going to pay you to philosophize when you graduate." And I panicked, and I looked into graduate education, and I realized to get admitted to graduate school in history or English, you got to know a lot about history or English, and so I kept looking. And to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It was clear to me you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that, and when I got to law school, I didn't appreciate until I got there, I went to Harvard Law School, that I'd never met a lawyer in my life, never met one. I grew up in a poor, racially segregated community. I started my education in a colored school. They didn't allow black children to attend the public schools when I was a little boy. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. And I just had never met a lawyer. And at Harvard, they put us in small groups and took us away, and the group leader asked us, "Why are you in law school?" And on that day, all of the 10 people in my group talked about their journey, and they were all the sons and daughters or grandsons and granddaughters or the nephews and nieces of lawyers. And they had stories they could tell about lives lived near lawyers that I didn't have. And I did something I shouldn't have done. I didn't talk honestly. I didn't tell them I'd never met a lawyer. I just told a joke and tried to look away. And as soon as that was over, I felt diminished by my absence of a connection to law. And it made me question whether I was someplace I belonged. And I called my mom and I just told her what happened. Of course, my mom was like a lot of your moms. My mom said, "You are the smartest person in the world. What are you talking about? You belong there." And then I started to think about it some more, and I realized that I had to gather those students, and I did. I asked them all to please come and meet me. And when we got together, I told them that I didn't tell the truth. I didn't tell you that I had never met a lawyer. What I should have told you is that my great-grandparents were enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia. And what I should have told you is that my great-grandfather learned to read while he was enslaved because he had a hope of freedom. Enslaved in Virginia in the 1850s, it was not a rational hope, but he had that hope. And when freedom came after the Civil War, my great-grandfather knew how to read. Despite the anti-literacy laws that could have cost him his life if anyone discovered that he knew how to read, he learned to read. And when the war was over, formerly enslaved people would come to his house once a week, and my great-grandfather would stand on the porch and read them the newspaper so they would know what was going on. My grandmother loved the power he had just because he could read, and she would wrap her arms around him when he would read the newspaper because she thought you learned to read by holding on to somebody while they were reading. He explained to her it doesn't work like that, and he taught her to read. And my grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life. She lived into her 90s. She cleaned other people's homes, but she was a reader. And she made sure that all of her 10 children knew how to read. And I grew up in this poor, racially segregated community, but my mom went into debt when we were children to buy us the World Book Encyclopedia. And in those books, we saw a bigger world. You didn't see a hopeful world outside the door, but you saw them in these books. And I didn't understand it as a 10-year-old, because, you know, Christmas would come along and you go outside and your friends are like, well, I got a bicycle for Christmas. I got a baseball. I got a basketball. And I'd have to say, well, I got volume G of the World Book Encyclopedia. But now what I realize is that, yes, I am the heir. I am the son of people who were abducted and kidnapped. I am the son of people who were brutalized and enslaved. I am the son of people who were terrorized and lynched. I am the son of people who were segregated and humiliated by racial segregation. I am someone who has had to contend with police violence. I am someone who's been presumed dangerous and guilty. But more than that, I am the heir of a lot of hope. I am the heir of a lot of love. I am the heir of a people who found a way to persevere when perseverance did not make sense. And when I tap into that strength, and when I think about that strength, I am persuaded that we can do better in the cultural landscape across the globe than what we have done to date. We can tell a more honest story, a more complete story, and we can reckon with the legacy of slavery and create a new era of liberation and justice and truth that our world desperately needs. I am ecstatic that so many of you are engaged in that process, honored to have had an opportunity to talk about it, and want to wish you the very best as we collectively find new ways to push forward this new era of truth and justice. Thank you all very much.
I'm a king, go. I think I'm a king, go.